Welcome to another episode of Retail's Most Wanted. We're the podcast that examines the latest issues related to organized retail crime and how retailers and policymakers are fighting back against today's organized crime syndicates. I'm your host, Marty Carpenter, and coming up on today's show, we'll be joined by Paul Singer, a legal expert on the Inform Act. We're going to find out what that is and what his involvement has been in that and how it helps in the fight against organized retail crime. All that's coming up next. First, this word from our sponsors. Retail's Most Wanted is brought to you in partnership with the Attorney General Alliance, where U.S. state attorneys general collaborate on emerging legal issues and the rule of law at home and across borders. Learn more at agalliance.com. Retail's Most Wanted is brought to you in partnership with LVT, securing physical environments through intelligent automation. Learn more at lvt.com. That's lvt.com. Welcome back. Paul Singer brings over 20 years of experience from the Texas Attorney General's office to his current role, where he helps clients navigate through state attorney general advocacy and enforcement at Kelly Dry. As a former division chief of the Consumer Protection Division and associate deputy attorney general for civil litigation, Paul has an insider's understanding of the attorney general's authority and investigation process. Paul, thanks so much for being with us and sharing some of your insight today.
Absolutely. Thank you.
All right, so you've worked extensively on something called the Inform Act. For our audience, can you just give us the nice summary of what is the Inform Act and what prompted its creation?
Sure. So the Inform Act is a civil law that applies to online marketplaces. So these are the large platforms that connect buyers and sellers, but really focuses on the ones that actually have a contract with sellers and where sellers can directly sell goods on that platform, right? So using sort of the payment mechanism on that platform, not where you meet up after the fact. At its core, the Inform Act is really a transparency statute. It's all about ensuring that these online platforms and marketplaces are taking steps to know their customer and to take action against sellers that don't comply with the requirements of the Act. It was created largely as, a means to help address some of the frustrations in combating organized retail crime. Many times we would see the criminals who would perpetrate the underlying crime use the anonymity of the internet to go and sell goods that they had stolen. So the idea behind the act is let's require some of these high volume sellers who are using these platforms to move merchandise to actually require them to provide contact information, bank account information, things like that to the underlying marketplace.
Gotcha. So there are multiple attack vectors when going after organized retail crime. Some folks are working on preventing them from actually getting a hold of the stolen merchandise in the first place. Others are prosecuting them, right? And this sounds like your pinch point is, all right, you've stolen it, but now good luck selling it. That's where you're really trying to make it an impact.
Exactly. The idea is let's hit them in the pocketbook, right? I mean, this is how they make money off of the goods. So let's try to cut off some of the access or make it really challenging to actually get compensated for some of these stolen goods.
Yeah. I wonder, have you seen it all as this process has been in place that does it probably first and foremost, your goal, as you mentioned, is to get them to stop stealing things overall. But I wonder if the first wave of that is it changes what they steal or what they're targeting when they go in. Have you seen any of that to a certain extent that, I don't know, maybe smaller items that could be sold more easily in one-off or smaller items that are sold one-off with a higher profit margin? I just wonder how that's impacted.
Yeah, so I've talked to some AP folks at retailers, and certainly the latter. We've seen, I think, a bit of a transition to try to focus more on goods that you might be able to you don't have to have the mass quantity of them in order to make more of a profit. But I think more so, and I know we'll talk about some of this later, I think, but more so what we've seen is some of these criminals pivot and try to get around the obligations of the Inform Act and even move some of their transactions to be more offline instead of online so that these obligations don't kick in.
Yeah. Can you tell us about some of those provisions, right? Like what are the specifics in there that they're trying to circumnavigate? What are they trying to find their way around?
Yeah, so there's three main buckets of requirements under the Inform Act. First, online marketplaces have to collect and verify contact and bank account information from high volume third party sellers. So this isn't everybody that sells. It's really the ones that are hitting certain thresholds and start to look like high volume sellers that are actually obligated to provide this information. So importantly is that verification piece. It's not enough to just collect information and take their word for it. You have to make sure that phone numbers, email addresses provided are actually working, right? So there are some pretty significant obligations put on the marketplaces. The second bucket is to suspend sellers that don't comply with these provisions. So if a high volume seller doesn't provide this information in a timely manner, the marketplace is required to suspend those sellers from transacting business on their site. And then finally, are for certain of the highest volume, high volume sellers, we'll say, there are some disclosure requirements on the marketplaces. So those sellers, you actually have an obligation that the marketplace has to provide who that seller is and contact information for them that becomes publicly accessible as well. And so when you take those three together, that's why I say this is really like a transparency statute, because it's all about identifying who those sellers are. One other piece that I'll mention that I think is really important is there is a requirement that marketplaces have a reporting mechanism. So anyone in the public, whether they be just an average consumer or an AP professional or even law enforcement, can use this reporting mechanism to actually provide information to the marketplace about suspicious activity. So it's basically like a required complaint portal that exists for those sellers that are hitting that threshold.
And these marketplaces that we're talking about, just to make sure that we're all on the same page, I hear that and I think like Facebook Marketplace, eBay, some big ones like that. Does it impact, I don't know if there are smaller ones everywhere else. Our show's based out of Salt Lake City, Utah. There's a local news website here that's very dominant in this space and has essentially like a very sophisticated classified ads that they run online. I imagine it applies to those types of marketplaces. Is that, am I on the right track there?
Yeah, so this goes back to that initial definition I was talking through, right? Was it has to be a platform that you actually transact the sale through. Okay, so like you mentioned Facebook Marketplace, which generally doesn't have the transaction occur on the marketplace itself. It's separate and apart from it. So there are limitations on who's covered, but yeah, I mean, generally, these are the types of online marketplaces that one thinks of when you're thinking of these kinds of platforms.
Okay. And you've mentioned like a high volume seller versus sort of just someone who's trying to move some stuff out of their garage. What's that like first threshold that takes you from just anybody to where you might be in this reporting area?
Right. So that first threshold is in the past year, if you have 200 or more transactions with a value of $5,000 or more, you are considered a high volume third party seller. It's actually a really good point, because another way that, I think we've kind of feared that criminals can circumvent the obligations of this is set up a whole bunch of accounts, right? And don't ever hit those thresholds to where you start to get flagged. Now, obviously, sophisticated marketplaces are able to trace the IP address and exactly who it is that's creating those accounts. But certainly, that's an area that I think we've seen that it's trying to strike a balance between finding a right threshold, but also trying to ensure that we're not discouraging legitimate transactions from smaller sellers.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. What role do state attorneys general or their offices play in enforcing the Inform Act?
Sure. So state AGs share primary enforcement authority of the act along with the Federal Trade Commission. Much like other laws that share authority like this, state AGs can bring their own independent case, but they have to notify the FTC, and the FTC has a right to intervene in a state case. Now, that said, many states now have their own state equivalent to the Federal Inform Act. And so what we've seen with that is, states may choose to go ahead and bring a case in their own state courts instead of having to pursue it in federal court and go through that mechanism with the FTC. The other thing I'll say is that the states do always have their other consumer protection authority that they can utilize in this space. And so there's nothing about the Inform Act that prevents them from bringing other kinds of cases. There is a preemption clause in it, but it's what we call conflict preemption, right? Which just means as long as you can comply with both laws, then it's okay to pursue and have a different state law that covers the same area.
Yeah, makes sense. So let's talk obstacles. What obstacles are the retailers or law enforcement facing or potentially facing when it comes to enforcement of the act?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing is to take a step back and sort of remember the ultimate goal of the act, right, is to help combat ORC. But on its face, it doesn't really do anything with ORC, right? It's all about these online marketplaces who aren't the criminals that were perpetrating the underlying crimes. And so, I think a recognition that there is sort of a limited but important role that the Inform Act has is sort of the first step, because I think we've even seen, law enforcement somewhat frustrated by the idea that this act doesn't really get at the criminals. But again, the idea behind it is to give law enforcement more data and more intel about those criminals to be able to pursue them. But even with that, we've hit on a couple of these kind of loopholes in the law that may allow, a really savvy criminal to try to get around it. We talked about that threshold and the ability to create multiple accounts. We also talked about the ability to move a transaction offline. So if you're not actually selling the good online, then you're not going to hit any of those thresholds that trigger the actual law. And then finally, I talked about that disclosure requirement, that disclosure piece where the highest high volume third party sellers have to provide their contact information publicly. That's only limited. It can actually happen post transaction. And so again, for like an asset protection professional who is trying to look online and see if there's patterns or identify things, it may be more challenging. The transparency piece of it has some hurdles to get through because you may have to do some buys to actually find out who that seller is just as a member of the public.
Yeah. We always think we're going to get policy right the first time, but most of it, in fact, needs some cleanup or some enhancement, some polish, if you will. What further legislative or policy measures do you think are necessary to either improve the Inform Act or support the goals that the Inform Act is trying to accomplish?
So we've seen some states try to tackle this exact question with their state laws, notably California and Georgia. Georgia actually passed amendments to their state Inform Act to address this offline transaction loophole. That amendment to the law was actually challenged, and it's currently enjoined from being put into place. There's a notice of appeal, so that's going through the legal process. But essentially what was challenged was whether or not that state requirement that would have expanded who's covered by a state Inform Act is preempted by the narrower definition of the federal law. And at least at the district court level, the court found that, yes, because the federal law provides this narrower definition, that's what has to control at the state level as well. I think we'll see how that plays out. I suspect that there's going to be, a lot of varied interpretations of this as it progresses beyond that. California has been considering a series of amendments that is still before their legislature now, some of which address this offline transaction loophole, others that actually put more requirements on the online marketplaces. So, everything we've talked about so far is about collecting and verifying contact information. There's no obligations in the Inform Act for the marketplaces themselves to be more proactive, right? And to identify and notify law enforcement if they see red flags or anything like that. That's what the California law is also attempting to do, is put some more burden on the marketplace to get a little more proactive and address this. Again, I think the challenge with all of these amendments is you're putting increasing pressure on an online marketplace that isn't the one that's engaged in the criminal conduct that you're trying to address. And so that's where I think you're going to find a really hard time in making some of these amendments stick. But I do think that we're going to continue to see states try to push the boundaries about what can be done. And then I think in turn, you'll see some federal law modifications to mirror those.
Yeah. You make a good point there on the regulatory side. Businesses don't generally love more regulation or more things they have to do, particularly in this case where they can say, we're not the problem. Our product or our service may facilitate the problem. Have you found them to be relatively receptive to say, hey, we get it. This is something that's not on the right track for society in general, and we need to be part of the solution, even though we're not necessarily part of the problem, proactively.
Yeah, I mean, look, ultimately, I think that the larger online marketplaces have been supportive, obviously to a degree, right? Like you say, right, there is sort of a line that they don't want to be sort of, put in the hot seat because of other people's conduct. And so it's understandable, but they have largely been supportive of, increasing coordination and collaboration among the private sector, law enforcement at both state and local levels, and the federal government, right? And so I think that that's really at the heart of what Inform does, is creates another tool for that dialogue to happen. But I really think what is bringing everybody together and is getting the private sector, including online marketplaces, more focused on these issues are seeing several states that are actually passing legislation to create task forces in those states where they're actually funding and requiring some of that coordination to happen. And I think that's where I think we're really going to see an impact, is the more collaboration that happens, the more buy-in you get from the private sector, and then the more everyone can work together to address the underlying harm.
All right, I'll get you out of here on this. Jump down the road 3 years, 5 years, you pick the timeline. How will you know that it's been successful?
Well, Inform, I think the way you'll know is if we've shut down online portals as being the means for them to move stolen goods, right? That's ultimately the goal, is what can we do to try to cut off that revenue stream that the criminals are using to fund these operations. And so I think the most effective thing we can see out of this is we have frustrated their ability to make a lot of money off of this, which hopefully trickles down and results in less crime overall.
If people want to find out more about your work on this or get further insight into your opinions on this, where can they go follow you, or where should they to go to follow you and see your progress on this?
You are always welcome to reach out to me. My contact info is on our Kelly Dry website. My email address is psinger@kellydry.com. Anyone can contact me at any time, and I'm happy to talk more about these issues. Obviously, it's something I've enjoyed following and working on, and really do feel passionate that this is something that can make a big difference here.
Well, Paul, thank you so much for your work fighting back against organized retail crime, and thank you for joining us today. We really appreciate you sharing this information with our audience.
Absolutely. Thank you for the opportunity.
That's it for this episode of Retail's Most Wanted. Thanks as always to our presenting sponsors at LVT and the Attorney General Alliance. Don't forget to hit that subscribe or follow button so you can catch each new episode. We drop a new one 3 times a month. You can also find us on X and LinkedIn and YouTube. Links for all that are in the show notes below. Thanks for being with us, everyone, and keep up the good fight.